relationship of philosophy to science has created many problems in 20th century philosophy, as the scientific view of the world has drifted further and further apart from our ordinary common sense picture. This is the problem tackled here by Professor Sir Alfred Ayer of Oxford University, who was the major English exponent in the 1930s of the movement known as logical positivism, and Professor Bernard Williams of the University of Cambridge. We're ready for you now. What do you want us to do? Would you like to come and sit down? Are you taking sound as we've done like that?
Yes.
That's right. Professor Williams, I think you're over here.
Right, thank you very much.
Professor Ayer. Come over a bit, Peter. Stand there. All right?
Yep.
Would you agree, Bernard, that one of the things that distinguished philosophy, or anyhow British philosophy in the last 30 years or so, has been its extreme reverence for common sense? This hasn't generally been true. I wonder why it's been so.
Oh, I think there's been an awful lot of it, yes. I think it's taken, interestingly, some rather different forms. I think perhaps the best, I don't know whether you'd agree with this, I think that the best way of going at this is the following way. Depending on whether one contrasts common sense with philosophy, on the one hand, whether one contrasts common sense with science. Because presumably quite often we mean by common sense sort of beliefs of chaps in the street and you and me and so on, which may actually be shown to be wrong just by scientific and empirical inquiry. Now, I suppose the most important way in which British philosophy has been very reverential to common sense is that it's been very reverential to common sense as against supposed surprising findings of philosophy, not of science, but of philosophy.
Well, I suppose, to some extent, as against science, too, because if you take the big figures, the people who really had most influence, people like Wittgenstein, Moore, Austin, anyhow, three of the biggest figures, they all seem to be saying that the common sense view of the world, the plain man's belief in chairs and tables and so on, and their observable properties, was something unquestionable, even by science.
It seems to me that there's been a continuous and very common move in 20th century philosophy, and not just in the tradition we're talking about. It seems to me even in odd ways true of continental philosophy, of certain kinds of phenomenology and so on, that the pretensions of certain kinds of 19th century philosophy, that is, that metaphysical speculation could by itself discover fundamental and large-scale facts about the world which are unsuspected by the ordinary man and by scientists. That idea, it seems to me, has largely gone.
Well, in a sense, I suppose, that's a good thing, isn't it? I mean, I think it's perfect to say there has been greater self-consciousness about philosophy. Philosophers wondering much more than they used to what they were up to, what their methods should be, what they could hope to achieve. And with that, I think, a limitation of the claims of philosophy. People came to think, well, it couldn't achieve all that much.
That's right.
That all these subjects have their own criteria, and what's the philosopher to do?
Yes. Now, I think that's right, and there is a famous remark by Wittgenstein, which you'll recall, that philosophy leaves everything as it is. And I think, in a way, what one ought to be doing is seeing to what extent that's true and what extent it isn't. Now, positivism is a tremendously strong example of the restriction of the power of philosophy, isn't it? In any straightforward sense. That is to say, at least, it's a restriction of the constructive power of philosophy. Yes. Because people previously claimed to find out various truths about the universe by speculative philosophical methods, and positivism said, absolute rot. The only way of finding out anything about the universe is by the methods of science, by the methods of positive science. That is why it's called positivism, after all. On the other hand, of course, it did rate rather highly the negative power of philosophy in the sense that it thought that it could, as philosophy, persuade us that a lot of things we knew made sense didn't.
Well, it made certain, if you like, philosophical assumptions to start with, namely that the only way to discover what the world is like was by looking at it, roughly.
By sense perception.
By sense perception, and by the elaboration of sense perception, which science represents.
Yes.
Now, I don't think the positivists wanted to put any restraints upon scientific techniques, so they did insist that they should always be controllable. I mean, well, verifiable was the key term. Well, then you get the conclusion, well, if philosophy is not competing with science, what else can it be doing? And the answer comes, serving science. I mean, you start by saying science has no competitor. If you want to describe the world. I mean, the assumption is that the philosophy is itself a branch of knowledge, seeks to advance knowledge. Knowledge is about the world. Science does this. There's no room for a competitor. What can philosophy do? It can only serve science. This is the positive position.
Well, serve and, in a certain sense, respect.
Yes.
Because it seems to me that there are two features of this positivist enterprise which are very interesting. One is the idea that philosophy always follows science.
Yes.
That science makes these discoveries, and then what philosophy does in the positivist picture is to clear things up, make them more analytically obvious, order things in a logically transparent way. Certainly great diffidence about telling any scientist what he should be up to, obviously. But also a certain respect in the following sense, that positivism was very keen on saying the world really contains just those things and no more, which figure in a scientific description of the world. When a philosopher says, all the world really contains is so-and-so, which has been, of course, the subject of much abuse and scepticism in modern philosophical treatment, saying things like that, what he means in the minds of many philosophers has been the world contains really just those things which render it scientifically comprehensible. And I think that positivism did that too, because it thought that all the metaphysics, all the more ambitious philosophical notions or the speculative notions of the past were rubbish, sort of froth that could be blown off the top of the glass to reveal the genuine scientific liquid below. And this was part of positivist, as I take it, part of positivism's tremendous emphasis on sense experience, that it thought that all scientific conclusions just were statements about observations worked up in a certain way, presented in useful kinds of way via the concepts of science. The idea that non-scientific concepts, or inadequately scientific concepts of a metaphysical kind, could have played a positive role in scientific thinking was, I think, alien to positivism, wasn't it? It therefore belongs a bit to the priests and kings kind of thinking.
I think it's a fair criticism of the positivists that they were, from the point of view of their analysis of science, rather unhistorical. And they didn't actually investigate how scientific theories had come about. And if they'd investigated it, I think they would have discovered much more metaphysics in their bad sense, and being scientifically useful. I mean, people getting at scientific theories through holding metaphysical beliefs.
Yeah.
If one takes a perhaps more open-minded positivist who doesn't try to restrict the way the scientists arrive at their theories, allows them to have metaphysical ideas, even religious ideas, in the development of their theories, but then says, well, once the theories are there, we can analyze them, criticize them, show how the concepts function, how the theory is verifiable, and so on, analyze its structure. In fact, carry out the positivist program. What's wrong with that as a conception of what philosophy should be doing? What does it leave out?
What does it leave out? Well, It clearly does leave out a lot of, I mean, obviously, it leaves out a lot of questions about value and about
yes,
moral politics, but leaving that aside,
as
far as metaphysics and the theory of knowledge
yes.
is concerned, well, I think that one thing that it leaves out is an account of the relations between what the scientist finds interesting and what he doesn't find interesting. You see, it seems to be one of the seats of philosophical puzzlement is this. Some scientific account gives us a story about what familiar objects are, to use a rather crude nursery phrase, made of, or what properties they have in terms of some sophisticated physical theory. Now, our everyday experience, the manifest image of things, in our everyday life, we have ordinary impressions of things about us, don't they, in terms of their textures and their colours and their surfaces and what they feel like and moreover, we have descriptions of them in terms of our sentiments, our uses, our purposes, our institutions and so on. And we have a whole lot of descriptions of a lot of physical things in movement, namely animals and people, in terms of actions, thoughts,
yes.
objectives and so forth. Now, scientific inquiries of various kinds will tell us quite a lot about what is going on in these various objects, what is the case in the environment, or set up patterns of explanation. Now, the scientist himself may well not be enormously interested beyond a certain level in how the story he's telling relates to the complexities of the story that we tell in everyday life, to the manifest image.
Part of the analysis of science, which we're relying to the philosopher on the positivist program, will be saying how scientific hypotheses are tested at the manifest level.
Yes.
So
right.
in this sense, he will be dealing with this problem of the relation of the two, because he's showing how statements at one level support statements at the other. Now, the question is whether we're requiring more than this.
Yes,
I mean,
well, I think
we're trying to put questions like, what is really there?
That's right.
I mean, is it a set of atoms or the familiar sofa that we all see? And is there any conflict between them?
Now, what occurs to me, it's actually worth mentioning for that there was an argument, you remember, by Gilbert Ryle on this subject that he advanced some years ago. It seems to me to be if I may say so, an extremely bad argument. But the way in which it's a bad argument seems to me to be quite interesting, and also to illustrate this point about the commonsensicality of some analytic philosophy. Do you remember this argument?
I do remember it, yes.
This is the one, you remember, that goes like this. We've got descriptions of the world around us in terms of our ordinary experience. Books, tables, colours, smells, associations, emotional experiences, institutions, policies, and so on. And then we've got a somewhat desiccated story, which is told us by physicists and possibly by certain kinds of psychologists, neurophysiologists, and so on, about matter in motion, electric forces, and reflected light waves, and so on. What is the relation between these two, which has been a puzzle for philosophy, obviously, since, at the very least, since the 17th century, perhaps earlier. Now, Ryle said the relation between these two things is like the relation between the books in the library and our ordinary reading of them on the one hand, and on the other hand, the accounts that are kept of how the books are bought and so on by the librarian or the treasurer or the accountant on the other. And the accountant's story, which is all in terms of numbers, which has apparently found a rather overwhelming similarity between accountancy and science, but it's all in terms of numbers, this represents merely one dimension, an abstracted element which can be put in quantitative terms. This is, of course, in no way conflicting with our everyday experience of the books as objects to be possessed, read, handled, perceived, and so on. The idea of this analogy being that, I take it, that physics just represents a certain abstracted quantitative picture, useful for certain impoverished purposes, but in no way upsetting to or inconsistent with our everyday, fuller and rounded experience of the world around us. I think that was the...
I think this is the point.
I think this was the story.
Yes.
But, of course, there is a rather vital weakness in this analogy, which underlies Gilbert Ryle's case, isn't there? Which is that nobody, from looking at the accountant's records in a library, could predict or explain either the colour or the content of the books.
Yes.
The powerful fact about physics is that it actually enables you to predict and explain the general character of the properties of the things around one. And of course it's explanatory power which connects the physical explanation with the idea that it somehow relates to what's really there,
Well,
as opposed to what it seems to us to be there.
I mean, I think it is a very poor analogy of Gilbert's. I quite agree with you there, but the point it was designed to make, however ineffectively it made it, was that the scientific and common sense accounts were not competitive.
Yes.
Now, do I understand you to hold that they are competitive?
Well, I put it like this. They're competitive in the following sense, that what unreflective common sense takes for granted in its ascriptions of colours and things to the world is either confused or wrong. And reflection on the scientific story may well lead one to think that in some sense the 17th century philosophers were right when they said the world isn't really coloured. That being a rather dramatic way of saying, not what would be overdoing it a bit, namely we're mistaken all the time when we say things are green, but for instance, there would be absolutely no point in talking about the colour of the world not relative to human or similar perceivers.
I think one of the strongest motives for taking the kind of position you have just been taking is our knowledge of the causal mechanism of perception. We learn about light falling on the object and light waves impinging on our optic nerves and so on. And so we come to think of colour as something that we contribute. But then, this is equally true of our perception of any other properties of the object. I mean, one perception of its shape, one perception of where it is, the same causal story. So how are you going to distinguish between what we contribute and what it does?
It seems to me it's not just so much that there is a causal mechanism of perception, but that we have frightfully good reasons for thinking of various kinds that, well, again, putting it a bit roughly, what colour things look vary enormously with the kind of observers are looking at them. It may be that the size of things varies with the size that things look vary with the observers. Oh, look, well, here, this splendid object here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it might well be, it's actually a marvellous example of a philosopher's material object, isn't it? Extremely solid. The colour of this, that to us is blue, might well appear quite different, it seems to me, to a different observer or different animal. It may be that the size of things varies. It may well be that some small organism was perceiving it would occupy a large part of its visual field, would appear large in that sense. But we can't understand any of those facts. We can't explain any of those facts. We can't render any of those facts comprehensible to us ourselves unless we have a neutral vocabulary in which all those situations can be equally described and rendered comprehensible in terms of scientific laws. And that vocabulary seems to be something like the vocabulary of physics. And therefore, that there is something to be said for the view, which was admittedly very crudely advanced by Locke and others in the 17th century, that there are certain primary qualities that things have, roughly those qualities that make them the subjects of physical science, which there is some sense in saying they really have. And there are other properties that they have, qualities that they have, such as their colour, taste, and so their smell, which really are much more relative to observers. And if there weren't any observers, there just wouldn't be any point in describing a world from outside without observers. There wouldn't be any point in referring to the colours, tastes, and so on and things. But if the world contained anything, you would be able to give a physical description of it.
What is meant by saying, what ground is there for saying that physics tells us what's really there, as opposed, let's say, to the common sense description, which tells us only, in part at least, the effect of what's really there on us. Now, can you make, in the first instance, what kind of statement is this, that what's really there is a set of atoms?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is this, isn't it? That of course, any statement of a metaphysical kind about what's really there has to be approached with a certain measure of sympathy. Mm-hmm. And Austin, who was very good at doing this kind of thing, quite rightly poured scorn on various uses that have been made of the word real by philosophy metaphysicians. We've already mentioned, I think, Moore doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's no inconsistency at all in something both being really there in our ordinary way of speaking, in our ordinary way of thought, and being something that's only there because I have, it affects me in a certain way.
Yes.
I mean, for instance, presumably the fact that I find the girl very attractive is a relational fact about her and me, and isn't a property of hers quite independent of me. Still, there's a difference between my really finding the girl very attractive and, for instance, as Austin would have pointed out, just pretending to find the girl very attractive, or some other contrast, such as Austin would have drawn to it really being so, her really being attractive, as opposed, for instance, again, to her being just made up that way. But, of course, you have to take these remarks, metaphysicians' remarks, with a certain amount of imagination and insight. And the force of the world is really, as it's described by physics, does seem to me to be that it's the only view which in the end systematically carries through what is an assumption of common sense, namely that the world can and did exist independently of any observer. Now, it may be said, any description we give of it existing independently of any observers, nevertheless, is a description which is given in our terms, and our terms are all developed from how it does look to us when we are observers. Nevertheless, it seems to me that one ought to be able, if one really does carry through to the end, the assumption, which is itself an assumption of common sense and of science, namely that the universe does exist in large part independently of any observers, we do start with distinctions between the properties which it obviously doesn't really have unless for observers and the ones it does. For instance, let's take an absolutely frivolous example. Imagine the world before there are any human observers, the Earth. Some dinosaur falls over in an undignified way. This could be described from us looking at the outside as ludicrous or absurd or comic. Nobody would suppose that there was any item which in any deeper sense was intrinsically comic or ludicrous in this world. It means would look to us if we were there, ludicrous or comic, with our standards of what's ludicrous and comic, okay? Well, in this matter of describing a world without any observers in it, we have to describe it, as it were, from outside. Now, we form an imaginative picture of a world which is unpopulated by human beings. But of course, we may actually, in forming that imaginative picture of the world unpeopled by human beings, be, as it were, covertly, really, regarding ourselves as an observer of it. It's rather like this present situation. I suppose a lot of people who are watching us have forgotten there's a camera here, as it were, though in a sense it's via such a camera that this scene is presented to them, and only because it's there that it can be so. But in fact, we can imagine the world without any observers, but the question arises, to what extent are we really writing ourselves in as covered observers of them? And I think it can be argued with regard to certain things like colours, that really we are. What we're doing is describing as the world not as it was before there were any observers, but as it would be if we were there as observers. The thing is this, is that the truth that phenomenalism and all such theories were the view that every statement was to be turned into how it would look.
Yes.
Now, well, the consequence of phenomenalism, I'm sure you'd agree, is which I think is a perfectly consistent consequence of that way of going about it. That is, that everything is dependent on the notion of what an observation would be. Seems to me the following. Consider, I've taken a large metaphysical way, consider two universes. One's got nothing in it at all. There is absolutely nothing. Or, if you like, utterly empty space, if you like that.
No, I don't much, but go on.
Well, if you have a difficulty with there being nothing at all, you just do Hume's trick. You take everything one by one and imagine it isn't there. And if you go on long enough, you must get form the conception of there not being anything at all. Okay? Now, that's one universe. The other universe consists entirely of material objects and aren't any observers. Okay? Now, phenomenalism says that the difference between those two universes is just the following. That of one it's true, and of the other it's false. That if there were observers, they would have certain experiences. Now, that notion to me is unintelligible. That the only difference between two states of affairs lies in what would happen if something which isn't there were there, seems to be unintelligible. It must be the case that there's some actual difference between them. And it seems to me the only coherent way of describing the actual way between them is in terms of, the phrase that I think we've already used perhaps, of a scientific realism. That is, in the minimum terms that are required to describe what's there in order to explain the perceptions that the observers would have if they were there.
Yes, I don't find this this difference unintelligible, I must say. I mean, I'm slightly happier with it than I am with this notion of an entirely empty universe, which I do find hard to
well, an entirely empty area of space will do the same. I mean, I don't have to have a universe to make this point. It just the point I think is a rather straightforward one. I mean, it does seem to be that what you're inviting and what the phenomenalist invited us to believe is that is something of the same form as the following: that I could have two absolutely indistinguishable empty boxes, which are exactly alike in every respect except this, that if I were to put a match into one of them, it would catch fire, and if I were to put the same match into the other, it wouldn't. And that seems to me, to use an old-fashioned phrase, rebarbative to reason.
Oh, yes.
That there could be two things which were exactly alike, the only difference between them being that if you did something to one of them, something would happen which wouldn't happen in the other case. Because we surely think that statements of the kind, if you were to do so and so, you'd see so and such, must be grounded in an actual difference in the thing.
I do think that, in a sense, we do start with the phenomenalist position, which we start with anyhow, from the point of view of what we know, with sense experience and sense qualities, and we then elaborate theories to explain them. And I would regard both common sense and physics as, in this sense, a theory. Now, I think where I might differ from you is in my interpretation of the question, what is really there? Because I think that asking what is really there is asking, what theory are you going to accept? And so long as the theory works, so long as the theory is successful in predicting and explaining your experiences, I don't think there is a genuine question as to whether it corresponds to something that is there, because I think one saying this is what there is simply a way of saying this is the theory I'm going to stand by. So like I take scientific realism simply as being opting for a physical description of the world, for the description of the world such as you get in the works of physicists, as opposed perhaps to a common sense picture of the world. But I don't think there is a further question then of this being right, but if being right is distinguished simply from being useful. I mean, I take a pragmatist position on this.
But now we do have a very interesting, complicated and paradoxical relation here, I think, between philosophy and common sense. Because there's a certain sense in which the position that you've just mentioned is, in a sense, more commonsensical than the scientific metaphysics, some critics would say scientistic metaphysics, which I just
common sense is an option,
as it were. And you're saying there's no privileged sense of what's really there, of the rather more hopeful kind that I was drawing.
Other than, of course, in the sense of certain statements being true. I mean, I'm not going to say there's an elephant in the room if I choose to think so.
Oh, no, of course not. No, I mean, I think we agreed about that. But on the other hand, it seems to me your position, which you referred to as a pragmatist position, flies wildly in the face of common sense. And, of course, this just illustrates how ramshackle or wobbly the notion of common sense has been in the discussions of it in recent philosophy, because it does seem to me that one thing that most commonsensical, ordinary people would take for granted is quite certainly that there's a lot of things there, and that human beings and observers are in the world among other things.
Well, this, of course, I accept, because...
And rather late arrivals, too.
This is what... I accept this, of course, because this is part of the theory that I'm opting for.
But then, what it does follow, that our description of what's there, independently of our arrival and our consciousness, just depends upon what we find useful. And that the question, what's really there, as opposed to our looking at it or our being there, is a question which is about us again. It's about our convenience. And that doesn't seem to be, I mean, it may be right, but it doesn't seem to be very obvious.
You're popping in and out of the theory in a way I don't much care for. But let's take it concretely. I mean, supposing it were the case that you couldn't represent, or plausibly represent, the scientific particles as literally parts of the little this thing that you're holding up, yes. And so one had then to choose between saying, well, it really is coloured, etc., as I see it, or it really is colourless and discontinuous. Then on what basis is one going to choose, other than simply what picture of the world am I going to hold?
Eddington said, he said that there was one table which was the table of common sense, which was solid.
Yes.
And there was another table which was the table of physics, which was not solid.
That's right, yes.
And this was a conflict.
Yes.
I think that one isn't very helpful. Because, I mean, there's a very, very shallow and straightforward way of reconciling at that level, isn't there? Which is to say, solid means, for given purposes, not having holes in it of a size sufficient to worry, as it were.
Well, I mean,
so, of course, for the common sense level, it obviously is solid and the other isn't.
Well, I mean, in this sense, you can reconcile them.
Holes in very small holes.
But this does mean taking the part-whole view. What you say is there are a lot of in fact, particles that are discontinuous, but they're so close to... I mean, the discontinuities are not perceptible by the naked eye, and therefore what is in fact not solid looks solid. And again, you have to say that this is a property of colourless particles, that in an assemblage they form an object that is coloured. Now this view can be taken, and then there's no particular problem.
Well, what I do
take that view, then you do have to choose, it seems to me, and I can't see on what basis you choose except simply a predilection, which picture appeals to you more.
Well, I do think, all I'm saying at the moment is that I do think that consequence is extremely paradoxical. It seems to me to undermine, in a certain sense, well, let's put it this way, it seems to me to undermine something which, even empirically, and as a matter of common knowledge, we believe to be true. That is, the world existing, that we are, in a sense, adventitious arrivals in the world.
Yes.
You see, the curious form of all idealism, phenomenalism, verificationism, all these doctrines, is that in a curious way they're anthropocentric in the end. They make the whole description of the world revolve round our experience. Now, scientific realism wants to take seriously and build into its metaphysics the idea that we are just, as it were, marginal additions to the world exists independently of us. Can I just go on? Because I think...
Yes, I think I'll protest against this in a minute, but go on.
Well, I think I may be able to put the protest. You see, I think that what a lot of modern philosophers, other philosophers would say, is, no, this is not so. We can represent in our language perfectly well the truths that the world exists independently of observers and that existed before we got here. All these philosophers would say we insist on is that the language in which we describe any world, including the world without us, imaginatively, if we try to imagine a world without us, or the world as it was before we arrived, the language we use must be our language, and we learn it in terms of our experience, and all its sense must be in terms of our experience. And I suppose the most drastic form of that view in modern philosophy is, in fact, the philosophy of Wittgenstein. It seems to me that Wittgenstein, more than anybody else, practically, in recent philosophy, was impressed by the idea that our language has the meaning we give it. It has the meaning which is derived from the way it's taught and is implicit in the way it's taught, and it can't reach out beyond the ways in which we are introduced to it. And he combined that also with a very radical and a very interesting set of reflections about the ways in which a practice or rule which has already been acquired can or can't bind you for the future. He saw there was something mysterious about the idea of saying, as we do when we teach some rule of behavior, because you've done so-and-so up to this point, you must do so-and-so in this next situation. He said, why am I not free?
Yes.
And would constantly come back to the thought that we found one way of continuing a practice, one way of developing a institution or so on, the necessary or obvious way to come back to the idea that this was an anthropological fact. It's a fact about human nature, or it might not even be, because he didn't really distinguish very much between, as it were, a psychological and an anthropological level here. It might even be a property of the group, not necessarily of humanity.
A form of life, he said.
A form of life. And Wittgenstein's famous equation of a language with a form of life, I think, enabled a form of life to be, in principle at least, one of a small group of people, of a tribe, a favourite example of his, or indeed of humanity. And sometimes some of his propositions seem to be relative to humanity. But I must say, Wittgenstein never does what both Hume and Kant in different ways did try to do, which was to show exactly to what certain of these propositions were relative. I mean, Hume was very keen on trying to show that certain sorts of ways we had of going on were relative to the fact that we were human beings. Yes. Kant was concerned to showing that various ways we had of going on were relative to the fact that we were something slightly more general, relative to something slightly more general than human beings, namely creatures who found out about the universe serially through some kind of sensation. But Wittgenstein, opposed to theory, doesn't do that. He says, just look at what we do. Now, this means that in some, at least in its more parodiable forms, I think Wittgenstein himself has often avoided this, but more parodiable, it does lead to some extraordinarily odd results, doesn't it? Because it means that, in the end, they can't really be wrong if the thing is a going concern. I mean, let's take the...
Well, all it can be wrong about, according to Wittgenstein, was in one's interpretation of what one is doing. I mean, he thought people were wrong to suppose that there were inner processes.
That's right, you had the wrong picture.
You had the wrong picture, yes.
You had the wrong picture. But
you had the wrong picture of your own behaviour in a certain sense.
You could have a wrong picture of your own behaviour, but that meant that every, and perhaps this is a very important idea in Wittgenstein, that every fundamental form of learning, in regard to anything like philosophical learning, would necessarily be a piece of self-understanding. And this is what many people have found, as it were, the Socratic or almost existentialist element in Wittgenstein, that what we come to understand when we see we were wrong was some sense in which we've deceived or misled ourselves.
Well, about a narrow part of ourselves. I mean, misled about our use of language, in fact, but not misled about our characters or
well, that I think is not altogether
stuff.
Clear. Because while indeed Wittgenstein tends to say always that what we are mistaken about is the nature of our language, his concept of our language is so generous that to be mistaken about our language is to be mistaken about our form of life. And therefore it's the way to have a wrong picture of what one is oneself fundamentally at. I think, like everybody else who's working in philosophy now and has been brought up in this tradition, it would be preposterous and wrong to deny that one had been influenced very much by this work. I mean, it's
even if only negatively.
Partly because of the enormous imaginative power.
Yes.
I mean, such enormous...
Well, it's a great literary achievement.
Yes, it's a literary philosophy. I mean, of course, it's tremendous part of the British tradition always to oppose those two thoughts.
Yes.
I mean, it's, for instance, the case of a writer like Nietzsche, to whom, of course, Wittgenstein bears a very strong resemblance in a lot of ways. The literary and the philosophical achievement are not totally distinct from one.
Well, let's take it in a concrete case. Let's take the implications many people have drawn from Wittgenstein, and whether he himself would have approved of them, for religious discourse. I mean, as I understand it, the idea is that religious language is, again, its own form of life with its own criteria, consists in carrying out certain practices, and it can't be criticized. Now,
I think that's probably a bit hard, but something like that street,
Well, I mean, you can approach it in two ways. I mean, one much more comforting to a religious person than the other. It can be said, it's true in its own terms, or it can be said the question of truth or falsehood doesn't arise in relation to it. It's simply a form of ritual, and then the only question is whether the ritual is carried out properly, or whether it fulfills its function, its emotional function or whatever.
Oh,
now the second would be discouraging, but the first, if we say it's true in its own terms, would have.
Well, if one's being very Wittgensteinian about it, if one's being very Wittgensteinian, I'm sure he wouldn't say either of those things. Because to say it's true in its own terms sounds frightfully sniffy. I mean, as if to imply it isn't true, really. And it isn't either true or false. It would be a kind of meta-remark that would be standing outside the whole game. I mean, he would say rather, what are they at when they say it's true? I mean, I think actually, as I think Dummett once remarked, the concept of truth plays an extraordinarily small part in the later philosophy of Wittgenstein. Meaning is not connected with truth. In the later philosophy of Wittgenstein, meaning is connected with going on. I mean, it's connected with assent, not with truth. Discover what the proposition means is to discover what elicits assent from the group, I think, rather than trying to transcend the whole practice to some notion of truth conditions, I think. Of course, Wittgenstein was prepared to say these sentences, these propositions, get their meaning from the form of life in which they're embedded. Well, the form of life certainly exists. And their going on in this way is what it is to come to understand what these religious propositions mean. But of course, for the believers, and I'm not here quoting Wittgenstein, but one's bound to say this oneself, for the believers, their meaning was supposed to transcend these situations in which they practiced in this way.
It seems to be very odd, because this seems to be to sever meaning from truth.
Yes, but I think that that's what Wittgenstein's theory of language tends to do. I mean, I think they're about acceptance conditions, conditions in which other people will say yes, rather than some, as it were, independently conceived truth conditions. As other
now, do you
philosophers
think that he thought the question of truth couldn't be raised with regard to these propositions, or just that it wasn't interesting to raise it?
I think he thought that it meant something else in regard to these propositions.
Well, this is what I meant by saying earlier that he represented them as being true in their own terms.
Yes, but true in their own terms would mean there's some way of their counting as true, yes. But in this case, it seems to be so difficult for him or his supporters to say that the picture that so many of the earlier believers had, namely of a reality distinct from them and this world, to which these propositions correspond or fail to correspond, so difficult for the Wittgensteinians to say that this was just a wrong picture. Or, let me put it this way, if this was a wrong picture, what it shows is wrong is religion, not a certain interpretation of religion. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? In this case, you couldn't say religion and all the meaning of religion really exists, but it exists in the practices of this world. Any picture of it corresponding to a transcendental reality is just a false picture, because it was the point of those practices to correspond to a transcendental world. So once you're persuaded that the idea of it corresponding to a transcendental world is nonsense, then what you do is stop engaging in the practices.
But it seems to me that just what differentiates, let's say, philosophy from anthropology is it does ask these further questions.
Well, that's what I think.
And it is that the Wittgensteinian program just sticks with anthropology.
Well, I think that there is something in this point, and I think further that, oddly enough, it hasn't come to terms with some of the genuinely anthropological problems.
It's just bad anthropology.
Well, in a certain sense, this is, I mean, obviously it's a very one-sided and unfair remark, but in a certain sense it's true. Because after all, a very rooted problem in anthropology, one which methodologists in anthropology are always coming back to, is what sense can be attached to comparisons between different cultures. I was saying a bit more, but I mean, let's take an example of this. Start with some simple-minded old 19th century utilitarian. He goes to Mexico or South Africa, Africa, where it is, and he finds people dancing in connection with the rain. He assumes that this is a bad piece of bad science, which was an ineffective way of making it rain.
Yes, well, it certainly is that.
Yes, but of course, it was a rather impoverished account, because the natives who did it didn't think of it just as a way of making it rain. I mean, the idea, the notion of pure instrumentality, which is right here, is
part of their culture,
belongs to a different culture. And the idea that it's a bad example of something we're better at is one which is now rightly blown on.
Yes.
On the other hand, Wittgenstein is like, Wittgenstein is like an extreme relativist who goes to the opposite pole from that, who says there's one activity, which is dancing in relation to the rain, there's another activity, which is seizing the clouds from aeroplanes, and they've got nothing whatsoever to do with each other. They're different forms of life. They see the world differently. Well, now you've got to explain the fact that when chaps come along and seed the clouds with salt or something, the people who used to dance stopped dancing. Now, the 19th century mechanistic theorists had a rather good explanation for that. Namely, they found a better way of doing what they were always trying to do.
My sympathy is more and more with the 19th century utilitarians.
But it seems to me that the sheer relativists are bound to say, it seems to me, when the people stop doing whatever they used to do and start doing what this other culture did, that this was a matter of sheer conquest. The only relations that can obtain between different cultures seem to be those of blank hostility or domination. What Levi-Strauss does, of course, is to offer us something like different local themes, compatible themes, in a common vocabulary. because the way in which the common vocabulary is unriddled by him is not very falsifiable or scientific way. But he again, his followers, are groping with problems about what common terms can we find for describing cultural variety, on what planes can they got to meet. And it seems to me that Wittgensteinians have often just not faced that question. They've just spoken of different autonomous forms of life without raising the question of a common plane of comparison. And scientifically oriented philosophy, of course, has tended to transcend all that, tried to strip all this away and say, in the end, the truth of our falsity of our views of the world will be registered by what we can achieve in the way of a shared, for instance, scientific understanding. I think that other forms of philosophy, for instance, the ones that we discussed earlier, in terms of ones that perhaps might even be over-enthusiastic, the march of science, have tended to try to produce an answer to this question, perhaps in simple-minded terms often. Namely, that even if different groups, and indeed different creatures, see the world differently, that they have different points of view on it, there is a common world they see, and that the terms in which the common world they see is ultimately to be described, of course, the more scientifically inclined philosophers would say, are the terms of science. Now, this is absolutely opposed, it seems to be, the Wittgensteinian outlook, in which the scientific way of describing the world is just one way among others. It represents one form of life among others, view to which you seem to be, you express some sympathy at various points in our discussion.
Yes, exactly.
So you may be more Wittgensteinian than
yes,
you
I think it is difficult for me here. I mean, certainly it is one view among others, this is true, but one, I certainly am also strongly inclined to say it's in some sense a better view. But now in what sense? One has to have then some criterion by which to measure, if you like, different cultures or different approaches, the scientific approach against other approaches. Now, I suppose one obvious, perhaps too superficial answer is that the scientific approach is much more efficient in the sense that it enables us to predict and explain in a way that other ones don't. And although one is, I mean, I have been talking fairly relatively throughout, I'd never have wanted to say that everything was all right, because in a certain sense, whatever one's culture, whatever one's beliefs, certain hypotheses are resisted by the facts. I mean, even if one can't, get at it independently of some theory, there is something there which limits one's theories. That is what William James used to call brute fact. And I think that I want to say that primitive cultures get punished by this brute element in the way that scientific cultures don't, or to a much greater degree than scientific cultures do.
But suppose that we were to agree that a scientific picture of the world came closer to reality, some terrible phrase, was in some sense more true than certain other pictures of the world. I suppose we were to grant that. It wouldn't follow from that you improve things by replacing a non-scientifically based or non-scientifically interested culture with a culture that was more interested in scientific inquiry. Probably a lot of people who are watching this might well feel the results of replacing cultures not particularly interested in scientific inquiry by those that are so interested has often been disastrous. But then the point is that that doesn't show, which is what a lot of people now infer, that scientific inquiry is not the best route to finding out what the world is really like. It merely shows that perhaps human beings are best to be protected from actually finding out what the world is really like. It's been an assumption of our science that we're never better employed than, assumption of our philosophy that we're never better employed than in finding out the truth. But perhaps this Hellenic assumption is one which present circumstances ought to lead us to question.
Well, if you mean by improve things, make people happier, this, of course, can't be taken for granted. Although I think one tends to exaggerate, romantic people tend to exaggerate the extent to which primitive cultures are happy. Yeah. On the whole, I think people are happy if they have a medicine that works rather than one that doesn't work, and happier if they provide themselves some material comforts if they can't. Yeah. I think one exaggerates the extent to which material prosperity, and I mean, in fact, what science actually brought has made people unhappy, but I mean, certainly you can't assume that any scientific advance is necessary a source of happiness, and of course often a source of great danger. And possibly there are cases in which truth should be suppressed. I'm against this, and in this matter too I remain a 19th century utilitarian. I believe that in the end it's better to know the truth, because if you know how things are, then you can plan better. You can.
I think that's, if I may say so, a shallow pragmatist justification. You don't believe yourself. You fundamentally think it's better to know the truth because it's the truth
for its own sake, certainly.
I think this does lead to perhaps one last point that one might make here, because I think, although in a sense I think it's a very obvious point, I think we might very readily agree on it. It's amazing, it seems to me, how often it's misunderstood. I think, in fact, it's tended to be true that scientifically based philosophies, or philosophies that have shown most enthusiasm for the natural sciences, since the 19th century, have tended to be the more, as it were, brutally optimistic, unimaginative, short on perhaps certain deeper perceptions about human life and values and so on. Whereas philosophies which have tended to show perhaps rather more imagination, less brutal and cheerful optimism, have tended perhaps in bias to be somewhat anti-scientific.
Well, I think...
I mean, if you turn to... if you turn to Carnap, or indeed Russell, come to that, and then compare that with Wittgenstein, just in terms of the tone about what human life is like, I think although one may well repudiate a lot of Wittgensteinian propositions, particularly his obsession with a quasi-religious issue of suicide and similar topics, it would be difficult to deny that there's some form of depth in Wittgenstein's philosophy, possessed also, for instance, obviously by the philosophy of Nietzsche, which is notably lacking in the philosophies of, say, Russell and Carnap.
Again, I think that although you were saying earlier that scientific philosophy as developed has something of an anthropocentric background, as it were, in fact, the dominant science in the early part of the century was physics.
Yes.
And people who took up the philosophy of science took it up from the point of view of physics. This is, I mean, very clearly true of Carnap. We just mentioned of Popper, too. And, of course, being interested primarily in physics, they weren't so much interested in human beings.
No.
And this is what gives what you call a lack of depth, is the lack of depth in human terms, because they aren't interested in human beings, except as subject to the laws of physics. And so you get actually a world rather denuded of human beings, even though the fundamental approach may be an anthropocentric one. It doesn't come at all into the foreground of the picture.
Yes, but I think that's the, I mean, well, that's of course that's absolutely correct. But even if you accepted the sorts of things that one was going on about earlier in this conversation, about the world being in some sense really like what it's like as depicted by a physical science without observers, that would hardly, doesn't deny the reality of the observers when they're actually there, or of their, in fact, problems of value or the substance of a life as it's actually lived. And of course, very often one finds that, in fact, the rather skeletal metaphysical pictures that are offered by some of the scientific realists and others, and the denser pictures, emotionally and morally denser pictures of a form of life which is represented, somebody like Wittgenstein, are, in fact, at least they ought to be, in the end, in some sense compatible.
They should be compatible, yes. I think in some sense they are compatible. In the sense that even the most complicated human behavior and so on is, I think, explained in terms of physics.
That is exactly one half, and the other half is the fact that it is, if it is, explained by physics, doesn't in fact mean that it lacked the forms of significance that it was thought to have before that was discovered.
Oh, clearly not.
For money on the side. He didn't really go into all this as a radical convention.
No. It's a very important part of it.
Yeah.
But he's and well, nobody knows what the answer to his Bartholin proposition is.
No.
I suppose against him, he didn't look after them. I think it's very easy. right.